Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter 5. The Countless Trees. Day 10. We'd been marching for some time when I thought I could see the outline of massive mountains in the distance, mountains that towered far above those near. I thought it was an illusion at first and began to blink my eyes. "Oh, those are there all right," Glember assured, noting my actions. "The northern skybounds," he said. So were called the mountains surrounding all Meristheria. I'd never seen them. My father had. He spoke of them times. They were at once beautiful and frightening, ominous and inspiring. "Where are we, Glember?" I asked. "A day or so north of Slane," he answered. "What?" I asked, astonished. "How?" I asked. "That cannot be." "I assure you it is," Glember answered. "But," I began. I was at loss. "How can we be that far in but 10 days?" I asked. Glember laughed. "That is the poison talking, human," he said. "Poison?" I asked. "I feel fine this day." "Human," Glember said. "We've been traveling 16 days." "16?" I asked, ending my pace. "No," I protested. "It's been but 9. Today is the 10th day." Glember looked at me. It almost appeared as though he pitied me. "Human," he said, ending my rambling. "It has been 16 days," he explained. "That is how the poison works." He sighed heavily, as though he had grown weary of telling me this, though it was the first time I'd heard it, or at least I thought so. I began to relay the days, and Glember waited as I rambled. Finally done, I awaited his explanation. "You are correct up to the 5th day. That is when you were poisoned. Then you are missing many days. We traveled further north on the 6th and 7th days. The 8th, 9th, and 10th days you spent with the 2 wizards of Nye. On the 11th day I recovered you, and you've been missing days since." "How can that be?" I asked. Glember nodded. "As I said, it is how the poison works." "But—" I wanted to protest. "Walk, human," Glember said, "and take heart," he added. "The poison is all out of you now. It lasts perhaps 10 days, and makes the skin an odd color. That color is gone. But it has been 11 days. This is the 16th, he repeated. "We are north of Slane. Despite the wizards, we made better time on the river than expected. We've lost no time." Yet I had. I lost 6 days. What little I could recall was of no comfort at all. Yet Glember didn't want to talk about the missing days. Although he seemed bothered that I could not recall, he was reluctant to relinquish their details even in part. I could only continue onward in silence, wondering where those days had gone. And just like that, the 10th day became the 16th, and we were leaving Meristheria behind. Day 17. At the end of the 17th day, we came upon a forest. While we would usually break for camp, Glember was spurred on with strength anew. I wondered if it was the leaving behind of most of Meristheria that eased the tension within him and left him more fit for travel. We traveled through most of the night and finally came to camp when the center night star loomed just overhead. It had become very dark beneath the forested canopy, and I'd found my legs scraped by the dense foliage on many occasions. Odd sounds of foreign creatures came to call, and the scent of rain was blowing in. "Sleep, human," Glember said, and yet this was the first night he did not tie or otherwise bind me for keeping during the night. My first thought was that I was beginning to gain yet a little bit more of his trust. However, as he sat and thought, and I began to drift toward sleep, I realized he'd not sleep this night. I awoke in the night as rain began to pelt me. It had grown colder, and the rain itself seemed as though it was close to freezing. We moved camp to a higher, better shielded ground, and I was fast off to sleep once more. Glember stared north. He'd pointed and nodded with our move. I realized now that he had not spoken. Had I not so many wounds on mend, I might have inquired of his preoccupation, yet I fell asleep. Day 18. When I woke on the 18th day, Glember was standing and looking my way. I studied our camp, and quickly realized he was packed and prepared to travel. I had slept part of the morning away, it seemed. "I thought I was going to have to kick you, human," Glember said. "Let's move." I managed to get to my feet. I felt well rested for the first time since my travels with Glember began. My pains were diminished, and most of my wounds were healed. My senses were sharp that morning, more so than much of the previous days. I came swiftly to my feet. I'd grown accustomed to the staff, and found that I was getting used to maneuvering with the contraptions and chains. I am uncomfortably aware that men will drag chains and walk to their own deaths if urged in slow or extreme measures, yet I had a plan. I'd not walk to my death nor give in to slavery. I'd been playing the gargoyle all along. He just didn't know it. We did not walk long when a sudden view unfolded. Emerging from the thicket, one ever burned into my mind. We happened upon a city within the woods. Great trees rolled skyward, and amid them were wooden huts. Not a mere few, mind you, but perhaps a few hundred of varying shapes and sizes. I don't think a one of them mimicked well another. Glember stood quietly at the edge of the city for a while, staring. His eyes would find a particular structure and fix there for some time before crawling over the village to another point where he'd become lost once again. I did not interrupt his thoughts. I thought he was planning something, looking for the best route through the city, for it was behind the city that the two great rock formations rose up to the heavens, revealing a passage between them, and Glember's eyes kept returning to that place. I knew it was where we were headed. I realized the city was quiet, although I looked here and there with scrutiny. My eyes could argue no man or woman happening by or peeking from a shuttered window. Neither did smoke lift from the scattered homes. The city was lifeless, and yet we did not long reside there. Glember ushered me as we moved quietly, taking refuge between the rising structures or behind trees as we passed through the city. Its lanes were of cobblestone, and a market held court in the middle of the city. Still, no tradesman waved from its stands, no scent of fruit carried the breeze. We gave the market no close attention, weaving between homes and around its outskirts, where we could remain hidden should something of life be found to reside in these deathly halls. On the edge of the city, Glember began to slow his gait. He no longer looked about, but became fixed upon the view before us. The village had been graced here and there with great trees that threw their shade down upon the rooftops and ways. Now we gazed on a field of trees, young trees that spanned a great distance. They were evenly spaced, and seemed to have been well cared for at one time. Doubtless these trees held significance. Perhaps it was a grove to be harvested, or a unique wood fit for long burning through cold winters. Now the brambles had begun to invade their domain. They sneaked into the rows and began to overrun the young trees. I'm more a man of travel. I might have recognized their leaves, but I did not. I don't think I'd ever seen trees quite like that before. I only once made the attempt to inquire of them. Yet Glember put up a hand to silence me. It mattered little, I suppose. After a time he motioned for me. He dropped his pack onto the ground, and I knew we were to make camp here for the night. I hoped we had missed something in that city, that a keen hunter had seen us march through the lanes and quietly made his way toward us with an arrow poised for the monster's heart. Glember tied me to a tree so that I faced all those trees. From sitting position, they seemed to stretch to the horizon. I don't think I'd ever seen a grove so large, not even in southern Meristherian, where such groves were known to supply most of the realm and were tilled with an endless variety of implements and tools. Glember walked a short way out into those young trees. He seemed to be inspecting them in a respectful manner, although he plucked nothing from them. I doubted they were old enough to bear fruit. Perhaps I was wrong. The seasons differed in the north, my father used to say. Although I was not tired as we arrived, sitting now made sleep trickle into my limbs and eyes. I had the strange feeling Glember was speaking softly as I fell away, but the wind was picking up. Perhaps it was my imagination. I doubted he was speaking to the trees. Perhaps the dreariness in my mind, as it took the hand of sleep, was more of a comfort than a reality of the cold world around me. Chapter 6. The River of Snakes. Day 19. I awoke early the following morning. It had grown steadily colder throughout the night, taking a sudden leap in the early morning, shaking me from my sleep with the winds and the cold stings of sleet. I'd come to alert wakefulness several times throughout the night, finding Glember still out there amid the trees. He was motionless, and at times I thought asleep, but I could not be sure. It was quite dark, and few stars came to call that night. I scanned the area and pulled my clothing in tighter, finding Glember's bedding close enough to reach. If he was not going to put it to use, I would. I draped myself with his bedroll and tried without success to regain sleep. My eyes came open now and then, finding the same gloomy view as before, until suddenly Glember was there standing before me. I had not heard him approach, and yet it did not feel as though I had fallen with sleep enough to thwart the footfalls of his passage. "It's time," Glember said. His voice was flat, and I realized by the look on his face that he'd not slept. Good, I thought. Perhaps he wouldn't travel as quickly this day. I realized the great mountains east and west were getting closer as we traveled. Were times on past, I could have been oblivious to something for days before noting it. Those days were gone. Such is the plight of a man walking to his doom, and yet I was now certain we were treading the northern fars. My grandmother's fabled escape route from Meristheria was beginning to appear more than an odd tale. Great mountains seemed to open up as we drew closer. We'd been traveling nearly 20 days now, with a great distance covered rapidly by the racing waters of mid-river shift. How far were we now? That was the day. The evening of the 19th day that I began to have odd recollections. I could little understand or piece them. An odd formation of rock or a sound would suddenly become vaguely familiar. I wondered in those early days if they were childhood memories. I'd traveled to a couple towns with my father and remember many of you. Perhaps, I thought, these were those resurfacing. I had no idea that my mind was beginning to piece together the lost days, that the cloak of poison was shimmering in the deep places of my mind, that memories were escaping their chains. Day 20. I recall a day when I was young that my mother found a snake in the house. She was retrieving a quilt from the clothes chest when she encountered it. It coiled up in a protective stance, and she screamed out in horror. I was made to summon my father from the field to deal with the snake, while my mother remained on the porch with a large iron spit. She was repeating, "Get it out," over and over. Regardless of what anyone said or did, she could only repeat that phrase, pacing and looking here and there, as if a great horde of slithering critters would suddenly come from all directions in an attempt to carry her off. It was odd to see her that way. My father tried to speak to her, and seemed surprised himself at her reaction. He had me follow him into the house, where he approached the snake. It waited in the chest, still coiled and watching. I remember my father explaining how people thought snakes coiled to better offend. He explained that they did so to defend, that such a position maximized the area it could protect. People say it's getting ready to strike, but mostly it's hugging itself in fear, my father said, and people do the same thing. He shut the lid of the chest as best as it would. That it did not close properly was how the snake found its comfortable bed. He carried the chest outside some distance from the house and opened it again. The snake had burrowed into another quilt, and he had to remove the quilt from which the snake emerged. It looked from us to the surrounding field, and finally darted for the tall grasses. As my father took a step toward it, it once again coiled and waited. As my father stepped away, it continued on. I never knew a snake could move so quickly. "You see," he said, "it only wanted to be free." He patted me on the head, just like anything does. My mother had slowed her pacing, looking toward us hopefully as we returned. My father cast me a serious glance that I did not understand immediately. "Is it dead?" my mother asked. My father, whose hand rested on my shoulder, gave me a squeeze just strong enough to interrupt my thoughts. "Dead as can be," my father answered. My mother let out a sigh and seemed to relax for the first time. "Good," she said, placing her hands on her hips. "I thought you were going to say that you let it go." She brushed her hair aside and looked back toward the doorway, still somewhat shaken, I suppose. "You know those devilish creatures would just find their way back if you let them live." "I know," my father said, winking down at me as my mother's head was turned. It was the only time I can recall that my father lied to my mother. Glember looked down at the bed of sand and snakes, the remains of what was probably a river during the rainy season. "We will have to move very slowly, human," he said. "These snakes cannot see, but they can bite." He kicked a rock over the bank, and it was snapped in mid-air by one of the snakes. He looked to me to ensure that I saw what happened. I did the same with a small stick. Although I could not move my legs with speed and send the stick into the air, it rolled down toward the snakes and was abruptly pinned against the earth by the fangs of a snake. These were not small snakes. I think if we were to connect both mine and Glember's legs end to end, it would sufficiently account for the average size of these fiends we faced, and they were quite numerous. I could not see the sand beneath them. They slithered over each other as a shimmering stream of scales. "Do you see how they move, human?" Glember asked as he eyed the snakes. The dried-up river ran as far as I could see east and west. There was no way around it. Glember did not await my reply. "If you move any faster than they are moving, you'll die," he said. I turned toward him. "We're building a bridge, right?" I asked. His expression did not change. He began to advance very slowly toward the river of snakes. "Glember," I asked. He did not reply. "We're building a bridge, right?" I asked him. "No," he finally answered. "What?" I asked. "Are they poisonous?" I inquired further. He stopped perhaps 2 arms' length before he reached the bed of snakes. He turned slowly, ominously toward me. "One bite will kill you," he said. "Now get moving," he demanded. "I'll not get halfway out there and have you running off." "This is crazy," I said, looking down at the thousands and thousands of snakes that crackled and shifted as scales rubbed against other scales. "Crazy," I repeated. "Are you afraid of snakes?" Glember asked. It appeared he was trying not to laugh. "I'm not afraid of snakes," I reasoned. "I'm just sane, Glember." "The sanest are those who conquer their fears," Glember said. He was looking over the river of snakes. "My father said that," he admitted. "Your father is an idiot," I said flatly. "My mother said that," he admitted. I think we both grinned. "Come, human," Glember entreated. "Let us get crossing it. It will take all the day." Indeed, the river was not very wide. Had I not the contraption, I guessed I could run and leap about halfway across the bank and land. Of course, I'd be dead, but such was the distance. I took a step forward and stopped my progression. I turned toward Glember with a questioning gaze. "If you move more slowly, they will not bite," he assured. "They sense movement, not smell or sound or sight, just movement." I was left wondering how any of them found their way to this great gathering without such senses. Still, as odd as it seems, I trusted his words were honest. He waited for me, and we began to approach ever so slowly. "Each one knows the rule," Glember said softly. "Not a one of them moves quickly, and anything that does is a threat or food." I took in a deep breath. I remember how my mother reacted. I told myself the fear was unreasonable. "What about—" I began. Glember interrupted me. "Your heart can beat as fast as it likes," he answered. "They will not sense that." I nodded slowly. Glember had read me. As our feet reached the bottom of the bank and neared the snakes, I stopped again. Glember turned toward me. "Trust me," he said. It was an odd thing coming from a beast as cold-blooded as the snakes. "I wouldn't let them take away my kill," he said with a grin. "I didn't drag you this far, put up with your incessant whining, so you could simply die to a few thousand snake bites in rapid and painful succession." He grinned. I thought to tackle him. At least he would die too, I reasoned. Glember seemed to sense that he had gone too far. His smile faded, and he turned away and down toward the snakes. "I've crossed it before, human," he said, "many times." He looked to the opposite side, just as my father showed me. He did not move for a moment. I thought perhaps he saw something on the opposite bank, but I could not see anything. "Slow and steady," he said, blinking away his distractions. And so we moved in unison, tiny slow step after tiny slow step. I closed my eyes as my first foot touched the wall of snakes. This concludes part 4 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it and dropping the link on your social media sites. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.